There, and welcome to another Saturday Matinee special presented by Heritage Mississauga. My name is Justine. I'm the Resource Center Assistant here with Heritage Mississauga, and we have a great presentation. But before we start, I just wanted to encourage everyone to like, follow, and subscribe to stay up to date on all the heritage happenings here with Heritage Mississauga. And let's just get right into it. We are going to talk today a little bit about the early Black history in Mississauga, from roots in slavery to carving a new home. So the research on this really began in earnest in 2006, when Aaron Brubaker took on a research project all about early Black history. And prior to this, very little information was known. So it was very much new information that was gathered. And since then, it has been a work in progress. I mean, even new information has been found out, even as recently as last year. So very much it is a work in progress, and very few historic images really remain of these early Black settlers. So if you do have any images, remembrances, anything like that, please reach out to us, because our own understandings are also currently and are evolving as well. So yeah, so if you have any information, we would love to chit chat. So of course, first we have to talk about the Canadian roots of slavery, because a lot of Canadians, some people actually don't know that we had slavery in Canada, and we certainly did. The British colonies participated in the transatlantic slave trade between the 16th and 19th centuries. So in New France, Upper Canada, and the rest of Canada as well had slaves. The first slaves were actually of Indigenous descent, and only really later on did become more African slaves. But even by the end, there were many Indigenous slaves as well. So the increase in African slaves really became after 1760, when American loyalists started coming after the Revolutionary War. And so there were Black slaves with them. Between 1671 and 1834, when slavery ended, there was approximately 4,200 slaves in Canada. And the reason for the amount of slaves in Canada being quite a bit less than in places in the Caribbean and the American South is because typically our economy in Canada was not based on slavery or slave crops. It was based on things like small farms where the families labor was sufficient, or also the fur trade, which required not as much labor either. So that's really the only reason. Well, that, and also slaves were expensive, especially coming from Africa. So for that reason, that's why we had less slaves than some other places. But even if the average Canadian did not own slaves necessarily, certainly we benefited. The average Canadian benefited from a slave economy, even like foreign, because if you take, for example, white sugar is produced from sugarcane, which was a huge slave crop in places like Jamaica, Cuba, other British colonies. So basically that was, if you're buying, white sugar and, other, cotton, tobacco, things like that, you're actively supporting a slave economy. So certainly we benefit. Also, too many people, like I mentioned, were coming from America and had, money from their slave crops in the US. So, certainly people in Canada are benefiting from slavery. Now, by the late 1700s, things are kind of beginning to change but very slowly. So Society for Effecting the Abolition of the Slave Trade was formed in London, England in 1787. And in 1793, a bill was introduced that aimed at abolishing the trade of supplying British territories with slaves. Now, the abolitionist movement was actually not immediately successful. However, it did start the conversation in Britain around the institution of slavery. And us being a British colony at the time, many of our lawmakers were, you know, in England or had close ties there. So very much the conversations that were happening in England were impacting us here in Canada as well. For example, one big thing that was happening was in 1781, there was a slave ship known as the ZONG that began to run out of water. So their solution to this was to throw 130 enslaved Africans overboard. And when they docked in Jamaica, they filed a claim for their quote unquote lost cargo. And the insurance company refused to pay. And so there was a trial that ensued that actually found in the slavers' favor. However, this was later overturned by the Chief Justice, the Earl of Mansfield. There was a free black man named Olade Equino who worked unsuccessfully to have the slavers tried for murder. But all this publicity and public outcry really spurred the abolitionist movement in England, and thereby also you know, affected what was happening in Canada as well. About 10 years later, in 1793, Lieutenant Governor Sir John Gray Simcoe passed a bill for the gradual abolition of slavery in Upper Canada, which meant that any man or woman currently enslaved would stay that way until their death, and any children born to those slaves after the bill was passed would be free at the age of 25. So there was no new slaves that were being imported. But still, the act was met with quite a bit of opposition, because we have to remember many of these, you know, the upper crust people in Canada and in England had, you know, were slave owners and, you know, had a pawn in that game, if you will. Then in 1807, we have the Slave Trade Act, which was effected in the entire British Empire. And this also did not abolish slavery. However, it did end the transportation and trade of slavery. So, you know, contextually, we have, you know, from the 1790s to 1800, we have over 1,000 voyages transporting 400,000 slaves. And from 1801 to 1807, 266,000 slaves were brought to the Americas. So just put that in perspective. You know, this is what's very much growing the slave population. And so even though it did not abolish slavery, it did look to end the transportation and trade of slaves. So it was a step in the right direction, but too little, unfortunately. The end of slavery only came about in August 1st of 1834, in which the government freed all the slaves within the empire and outlawed slavery. Because of the previous you know, gradual work towards abolition, there were very few slaves, people that were currently enslaved when that happened. It was estimated at less than 50 people. And with the abolition of slavery, the movement of fugitive slaves into Canada from the United States began in earnest. So we have to also look, of course, at the American roots of slavery, because this very much impacted us in Canada as well. So slavery began in the American South in 1619 Virginia, but Massachusetts was actually the first colony to legalize it in 1641. And in 1660, the Royal African Company was established to transport slaves en masse using the slave ships, which were basically just packed full and very inhumane conditions. Slaves were largely of African origin, though also those of indigenous descent were also used for some time. But, you know, the African population, it was seen as, well, if they're coming from all this way, then it's going to be very hard for them to run away because they don't know the terrain, they don't know where they're going. You know, it's very disorienting, and thereby easy to recapture them. Tobacco and cotton were the major plantation crops in the American South. And the growing abolitionist movement in the American North was the major factor behind the American Civil War in the 1860s. And during this time, there was a lot of violence that was basically legally authorized. So this is a very dark period of history in America. But in 1850, something happens, which is that they passed the Fugitive Slave Act in the United States. And this is important because prior to this, you know, people were certainly running away. They were trying to escape as best as they could. You know, people didn't take it lying down, right? But once they reached northern states, they could sometimes live freely. And, you know, it was hard for the masters to kind of catch them again and all that. But this act made it that basically all escaped slaves upon their capture were to be returned to their masters. So it didn't matter if you were, you know, you escaped 10 years ago and were more or less living freely, like you would be recaptured. And this also authorized slave catchers to, you know, go as far north as right up to the border. And because of all these slave catchers coming up into the north, which historically had you know, not been as favorable to slavery to begin with, you know, it was very unpopular in the American North, this act, and it very much propelled the abolitionist movement. You know, but for the Black population, both free and enslaved, they're no longer safe anywhere in the country. Because, you know, even if you're free, like these slave catchers are sometimes not going to care, you know, are you free, are you not? They're just gonna, you know, take you. So you're really not safe anywhere in the country anymore. So it's no wonder that between 1850 and 1860, the Black population in Canada increases from 35,000 to 60,000 people. And many of those people came on the Underground Railroad, because Canada was seen as this land of freedom to kind of start a new life. And it operated between 1820 and 1865, when slavery was abolished in the US. And it worked on this network of secret routes, safe houses, and conductors, which were people who assisted the former and fugitive slaves to escape Canada. There's also a solitary lantern that was often put in the window of to kind of denote safe houses and safe buildings. So there are always these little kind of symbols that were used. It's estimated that between 30,000 and 100,000 slaves escaped to Canada via the railroad. Another symbol that was often used was the North Star, which was used to symbolize Canada, but also your way to freedom, because a lot of the runaway slaves would follow the North Star northwards, and they would travel at night. They would follow various routes, safe houses, and various destinations into Canada, ending at terminals in Canada. And while historic Mississauga is not one of the ending points or terminals, many local areas were, such as Oakville, Hamilton, Toronto, and Orangeville. Once people came into Canada, they often dispersed, and making it very hard to trace them. And to be fair, many of them hid their ancestry because, you know, they're not necessarily going to want to put up their hand and say that they are, you know, an escaped slave. They just want to, you know, blend in type thing. Now, and this is also not to say that there were no prejudices in Canada. There certainly was quite a bit of discrimination. Certainly there was enslaved labor traditions, because, you know, once again, we had only abolished slavery like 20 years earlier. And of course, social hierarchy. I mean, many of the people were given, you know, menial positions. You know, there was housing discrimination. There was a lot of stuff, of course. Some of the people that helped on the Underground Railroad were people like Benjamin and Nathaniel Paul, who were active abolitionists in Albany and helped to organize the Wilberforce settlement in Ontario. Both the brothers were ministers with the African Baptist Church, and they played significant early roles in the establishment of the Underground Railroad. Many who would come to Toronto area actually did have connections to the Paul brothers. And you see that sometimes when people would come to the area, they would take like freedom names is what they called it. Because if you think about it, many of these people's last names were actually the last names of their slave owners. And so when they came to Canada, they frankly didn't want those names. They wanted new names that they chose for themselves to reclaim their names and their identities. And so you see people who kind of cross paths with the Paul brothers afterwards taking on the Paul name, which is very interesting. And we do actually see that on our own landscape. Everyone knows, of course, as well, Harriet Tubman. She was born a slave and escaped in 1849, traveling by night to avoid slave catchers for 5 weeks. She lived in St. Catharines as well, and was an active abolitionist and also a spy during the Civil War. She helped to free slaves, and it's estimated that she rescued 70 people during 13 trips to Maryland. And she was known as Moses and was known for never losing any of her cargo or people along the way. Captain Robert Wilson was an Oakville ship captain who commanded the Lady Colburn, and he is known for transporting countless fugitive slaves from Ohio to the Oakville harbor. And he hid them in the hold of the grain shipments. Another interesting person is Canada Jim, as he was known. His real name was James Wesley Hill, and he was born a slave in Maryland and escaped in the 1840s, crossing the border in a packing box. He later settled in Oakville, where he had a strawberry farm. Back then, that was like kind of strawberry capital of Ontario. He led an estimated 700 fugitive slaves from Maryland to Oakville over time. And when the people did get here, he actually gave refugees work on his farm. And like I said, when people did come, they often dispersed, and but some people did actually create small Black settlements. So there's settlements like the Wilberforce colony, which was active between 1829 and 1850. And then there's also the Oro settlement, which was active between 1819 and 1900. And also the Dawn settlement, which was founded by Josiah Henson, who was born into slavery and escaped into Canada in 1830. He founded a settlement and a school for fugitive slaves near Dresden, Ontario, called the Dawn Settlement. And today you can actually go there and you can see the Uncle Tom's Cabin historic site, which kind of tells his life and his story. And now the reason that it's called that is after a book of the same name, Uncle Tom's Cabin, which was written by a white abolitionist, Harriet Beecher Stowe, and published in 1852 in Philadelphia. Now, this, like I mentioned, was written by a white woman and was very much for white abolitionists, or the white population to become abolitionists, not for Black people. So there were many problematic stereotypes and language used therein. But that being said, it did fuel the white abolitionist movement, and it became the second highest selling book in the 1800s after the Bible. Many argue that this actually set the stage for what would become the American Civil War. And this story was inspired by the life of Josiah Henson of the Dawn Settlement. Another kind of local thing that was happening was Anti-Slavery Society of Canada in Toronto, which was founded by George Brown, the founder of the Toronto Globe newspaper, and was established in 1851. and so that was after, kind of in response to the Fugitive Slave Act in 1850. And so because of this, a lot of Black Canadians supported Brown's political rise to power, and he actually became one of the founding fathers of Canada. And so many people say that, you know, Canada literally would not be Canada without Black Canadians who supported Brown. The Anti-Slavery Society of Canada in 1851. It was founded to basically help with the abolition of slavery in North America, also protecting slaves and supporting the Underground Railroad. And a local connection is that Reverend Robert Orr of Streetsville's St. Andrew's Church was a vice president. Another thing that was also very active in this kind of 1850s time period was the many newspapers that helped to build momentum within the abolitionist community. So the North Star, the Voice of the Fugitive, the Provincial Freeman were just some of the active newspapers of that era. Frederick Douglass was the founder of the North Star newspaper, and he was an escaped slave from Maryland who became an abolitionist leader and a brilliant orator, to the point where some people actually doubted his story because he, you know, as many people know, there's these stereotypes of who a slave is. You know, they're illiterate, they you know, they are not maybe as intelligent, right? Like these are stereotypes, they're untrue, but that's a stereotype. And Frederick Douglass was absolutely none of those stereotypes. Like he was absolutely a brilliant orator, and could really hold his own. And so he actually wrote 3 autobiographies kind of in response to people saying that maybe he wasn't who he said he was. He's like, no, this actually happened to me. Yeah, and so he also founded, like I said, the North Star. And the slogan of the paper was, right is of no sex, truth is of no color, God is the father of us all, and we all are brethren. And so but how you can also tell by that is that he also was a supporter of women's suffrage. He was also a guest speaker for the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada in their inaugural 1851 meeting. There's also another man, Henry Bibb, who was an American born escaped slave and leading abolitionist, and he established the Voice of the Fugitive newspaper. And in 1850, he published his best-selling autobiography. And he also founded the Refugee Home Society in 1851 that helped Black refugees in Canada kind of get back on their feet once they got there. And he was also an executive with the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada. Marianne Shadd Cary, which many people know, she was an anti-slavery activist, born free in Washington. But as I mentioned, after 1850, it was still dangerous for even free Blacks. And so in 1853, she moved to Canada, where she established the Provincial Freeman newspaper. And she became the first female publisher in Canada. And her newspapers focus on empowering Black voices. And then another person who worked with Marianne Shadd Cary was Reverend Samuel Ringgold Ward. And he fled as a child from slavery to New Jersey. And in 1851, he kind of got in a bit of hot water, so to speak, because you know, he's this reverend, he's preaching on abolition, and it comes to his attention that this man, William Jerry Henry, has been caught by the U.S. authorities. And of course, as per the Fugitive Slave Act, Henry must be returned to his master down south. And so he ends up rescuing Henry, and because of that, he's in a lot of hot water. And so Ward has to flee and go to Upper Canada. So he comes here, and this is where he works with the Provincial Freeman. And he also lectured very widely for the Anti-Slavery Society of Canada in both Upper Canada and Britain, All these abolitionists, they all knew each other. So he knew Henry Bibb, and all these different people. And there's actually a letter that he wrote to Henry Bibb in March of 1852, which was later published in The Voice of a Fugitive. And he mentions that he traveled through Peel and Toronto Township, which is now Mississauga. And he writes that, you know, there were the agricultural lands were really amazing, and it was a great place for refugees to settle. But he did also say that much work needs to be done in terms of you know, problems with discrimination. So certainly there was issues with discrimination. Now he was very adamant and outspoken about on this topic, because many white abolitionists, they basically only cared about abolition, and after that their hands were clean and they didn't really care. But of course, as we all know, many issues remain after that. And so he believed that racial equality was the goal, not only abolition. Abolition is only the baseline of just, okay, now you're a human, like now you're considered a human, right? Because before that you're not. So that's like only the baseline, but we need to be striving for more. So in terms of those who are actually settling in historic Mississauga, I mean, it's kind of a little bit like, you know, a scattering of seeds in the wind, because historic Mississauga really was not a place where Black immigrants congregated. For example, in Peel region, there's no records of an African Methodist church, no Black, specifically Black schools or Black community. So it's very challenging to find these people. Some did come, and we know that, likely distance from the American border and the geographic obscurity were some incentives, but they did not tend to stay long. It tended to be just more or less a jumping off point, and then so they would be in one census and gone by the next type thing. And so because of this, they left very little evidence of their existence. It doesn't mean that they didn't exist. It just means that they're difficult to find on the historic record. And it kind of makes you wonder, like, why is it so hard to find these people? Because, you know, when you look at their white counterparts, you can find many times lots and lots of information about these people. But then, you know, the people that are living, the Black family that's living right beside them, you find nothing, right? And we have to kind of think critically about that, because there's a reason behind that. Certainly there's limits about how the information was recorded, and the fact that, you know, primary sources don't always tell you all of the information, but also too, there's a privilege to being able to record your own history and your own story, because, you know, many of these people were not literate, and so they couldn't write a diary, they couldn't write their story down. They could only, you know, pass it down via oral histories. Also, there's a privilege to the recorder valuing your story and saying, I want your story to be remembered. And we have to think about who was actually recording, because everyone has bias. For example, Peel historian William Perkins Bull is a great source in terms of learning about you know, those in Peel in the past, but he was also very bigoted. And so is he going to accurately talk about Black people in Peel? Like, maybe not, right? So we have to look at that. And of course, you know, we also have to think, why is the information being recorded? What questions are being asked? You know, when you see on a census record, it only tells you, you know, names, birthdays, you know, country of origin, things like that. It doesn't tell you what are their hopes, what are their dreams in life. And also, and this is going into even modern day, do Black Mississaugans feel comfortable telling their story, right? Like, would a Black family be comfortable telling, you know, Perkins Bull that, you know, they're fugitive slaves and all that? Probably not. And do people even nowadays feel comfortable telling their story? Hopefully more so, but this is still something that we struggle with. So because of that, there's very little information of those who actually did settle in historic Mississauga, but we do have some stories, and we are trying to add to this. So one of the people that we know settled in historic Mississauga was DINAH Green, and she's recorded as a servant or potentially a slave of the Chisholm family of Oakville, who actually founded Oakville. And she came to Mississauga with Jane Chisholm, who married Joseph Silverthorne in 1807, and they lived in the Cherry Hill house, which still remains to this day. And DINAH died prior to 1861 and was buried at the Dixie Union Cemetery, though her exact burial location is unknown and unmarked. After she passed away, Fannie and Lettie Paul came to live with the Silverthorns. Fannie, or Old Fan as she was known, to be a former slave, and Lettie was possibly the daughter of the slave owner, but we're not 100% sure. It is thought that they came to Canada via the Underground Railroad. And we don't know much about them, but we know that in 1894, Lettie married William Hutchinson, another early Black immigrant. And this was covered in the local newspaper, which in part read that they were literally covered with showers of rice and good wishes, which I love that. And so that was kind of the end of the Pauls at Cherry Hill. Then the Duncan family, we see Benedict Duncan, who was actually a slave in Maryland for 28 years. And he had the unusual opportunity to be able to go to school. So he actually wrote in part about his experience, saying he had no trouble of getting off, meaning escaping, and that he walked 150 miles of the way here. And he settled in historic Mississauga by 1861, but later relocated to Oakville in the 1880s. And this is likely because Oakville had a more established Black community. And then we see a few people in Port Credit who are of African descent as well, such as Alexander Hunter, who worked for James Robinson Shaw at the First Methodist Church. He was also married to Bridget, who is an Irish woman. In 1887, the Port Credit Council minutes record that it was resolved that the petition of James R. Shaw, so his employer, and 32 others in reference to Alexander Hunter and his wife, that the Reeve be instructed to have them placed in a house of Providence or some other public institution and thereby cared for. And the next year in 1888, it's obvious that he has passed away because they talk about covering his burial expenses and also having Mrs. Hunter removed to the House of Providence. And then another man is Samuel Carter, who is affectionately known as Old Sam in Port Credit, and he was a fugitive slave who lost both of his legs due to frostbite and exposure during his escape to Canada. It's believed that he lived on Old Sam's Lane, which is now Wesley Street. And in 1888, it was moved that Mr. Lynn and Mr. Oliphant be instructed to have Samuel Carter removed to some place of comfort and have his wants attended to for the present time. So it's speculated that at that point he was his health was deteriorating, and later that year he passed away, and the council actually looked after his burial expenses. Another man in Port Credit was a Dr. Ben, who's documented in early Port Credit histories as having been born in Africa, captured and sold into slavery in Virginia. But he escaped to Canada in the 1840s and came to Port Credit. Now, this person is believed to be Benjamin Workman, who worked as a farm laborer and was married to Hannah Workman. And together they attended the local Methodist church. A recent find was the Thomas family, and they're one of the only people who we actually have photos of. So John Dorsey, who was a fugitive slave from Maryland, and he married Catherine Ann Thomas, who was a former enslaved woman. It appears that there was an assault from the slave owner, which resulted in the birth of her child Mary, born circa 1846. And at some point, Catherine is freed in this whole process. And so the family flees to Upper Canada, along with another one of their children, George, who was born at 1849. And it seems that John Dorsey took the Thomas name instead of all of them taking the Dorsey name. He took the Thomas name to mask his identity. And in 1851, they show up living along Southdown Road in historic Mississauga. And according to their granddaughter, Amy Thomas, Catherine's former slave owner made several fruitless attempts to actually recapture Catherine and her daughter, Mary. Later, they moved to Canesville and then purchased a farm in Sanhope Township in 1871. Another family in historic Mississauga was the Ross family, and they lived on the Sear Park farm at Cawthra and Burnhamthorpe, which is owned by George Woodford Ross, who was born a slave in Virginia and married DINAH Paul in 1834. And they bought the farm in Mississauga in 1836. And they had 11 children, and the farm remained in the family for many generations. And just talking about a legacy, his grandson, Private Wilfred Winstanley Cook, actually fought and served in the First World War, and we do actually have an image of him, but unfortunately he was killed in the war. So they made the ultimate sacrifice. And also the interesting thing about this is, as I mentioned, their homestead was called Cedar Park, which was actually named after the James Ross plantation in Virginia, from which George Woodford Ross had been enslaved there. And the slave owner had basically had 5 children with his slave Mary Woodford, including George. And between 1801 and 1806, James Ross freed the 5 children and 2 additional children from another slave. However, he did not free Mary, the mother. So he was not a good guy. Well, he's a slave owner. He's not the good guy here, by the way. And when they came to Canada and they bought their homestead and their farm, they actually named it after the plantation in Virginia, which I thought was very interesting. And so you can see them listed in the 1870s on the atlas right there. And you can also see that the blue star denotes where the location of a 1935 farmhouse, which actually survives to this day, and an orange star, which shows the likely location of the Ross homestead, which survived until the 1970s. So we do have pictures of the original homestead, but it no longer survives anymore. And then there's also some additional census finds that we still feel like there's more to discover, basically. So in 1861, we see the Spencer family. Parents are born in the United States, children in Canada. John Spencer Sr. and his son Jr. are both listed as laborers. So at the age of 8, the son is not in school, but a laborer. And by 1871, the father is not listed. His wife is not listed as a widow, though, so we're not really sure where the father went. It could be that he was not there when the census officer was there. We're really not sure. And then the trail basically goes cold, in Mississauga at least. In 1911, their daughter, Sarah Spencer, born circa 1855, actually shows up in the Coburg Asylum for the Insane. And she later dies in 1927 in the Ontario Hospital in South Toronto, which was also basically an asylum. And she has no relations to speak of. So what happened to the rest of the family? And why was she in an insane asylum? I don't know. We don't know. So that's another thing that we're really trying to figure out, basically. I think that there's a lot more to this story. I just haven't uncovered it yet. Another family is William and Marianne Bell. In the 1861 census, they're a married couple and living in Arundel. And there's also a boy at age 10, John Shepherd, who's also living with them. And we don't know who these people are. There's some ideas who they are, but we are not sure at this point. And so we need to do more research into this. Also, the census record lists it has after their names JE, and we don't know what that stands for. So there's a lot of questions in census records, to be honest. Yeah, we're not sure. So we're hoping that more research and understanding will be done, and hopefully we will have more answers in the coming years. So after hearing about all these people that were in historic Mississauga, one might be thinking, well, was there racism in Mississauga? The short answer is absolutely yes. And we can't shirk away from that. But to what degree is it's what we're not sure of, because it often depended on where you lived, where you worked. Often what we see is when the white population felt threatened economically or otherwise, this is when tensions began to rise. And often as more refugees entered Canada from the United States, the more unwelcome they felt. And this often happens when there's a larger Black population. For example, in Oakville, the KKK was active. But in places where there maybe were not as many people, maybe they could have flown under the radar a bit more. So it's unclear, but certainly there was discrimination. There's also systemic issues in employment, housing, service, etc. One good example is the sleeping train porters who were often Black and employed to do menial jobs, and were highly discriminated against, and they ended up actually forming a union. And so, certainly there's a lot of issues in historic Mississauga and elsewhere. Yes. And to give an example, more locally, everyone knows probably Solomon Northup. He wrote 12 Years a Slave from his experience of being born free and then being kidnapped and sold into slavery in 1841. And after that experience, he wrote the book 12 Years a Slave, which is now a movie as well you can watch. And the last mention of him ever in public is in Streetsville in August of 1857, and it's covered in the Globe. And it says that basically he was at a scheduled lecture where the crowd jeered him off stage, and he was actually forced to flee. So yes, discrimination. Then about 100 years later, we have the example of James Marshall, who was an Avro-Canada employee, and they had this employee tournament at the Lakeview Golf Club that was held in 1954. And the previous year, James Marshall had actually won the novice tournament. And so he was scheduled to compete again. However, the golf club alleged that white patrons did not want to play on the same fairway as a black man, and Marshall was banned. And there was a lot of public outcry about this, and Avro Canada actually ended up canceling the tournament. And so, you know, no, there was no official segregation, but we have to remember this is, you know, basically the height of the civil rights movement. This is, you know, Jim Crow laws in America, right, are happening. So, you know, we're in another country, but like we're right there. And certainly it's affecting us. And certainly, you know, many people are racist and are going to take things into their own hands. And so that seems like that's what happened here. Also too, I would also say that what I've been speaking about up to this point has been, you know, in this early Black population, which was mostly freed, formerly enslaved Black people from America and Canada. However, in 1910, there was an immigration legislation that allowed the government to prohibit and or deport immigrants that were unsuited to the climate or requirements of Canada. Meaning that basically, if they didn't, you know, want Black people in the country, they could just say no. And that's basically what happened. So you don't see people from other parts of the world coming to Canada, other Black people. So there's very much this kind of separation of this early Black community. And then in 1967, the points immigration system is introduced, which assesses people based on education, skills, and employment prospects rather than race. And so this meant that people from the Caribbean, different countries in Africa, they were all allowed to immigrate at that point. And so you see a huge influx. And so the early Black population is very much not the same Black population that you see in Mississauga today. And of course, issues still remain. Of course, racism continues, but also colonial reference markers and place names, remembrances, they often don't make reference to slavery, even though, you know, many of the people made their money, their prospects through these very nefarious ways that were connected to slavery. Even as I mentioned, even if they didn't have slaves themselves personally, they often had you know, interests in slaves elsewhere. They were supporting even just economically slavery institutions otherwise. Many early families had connections to slavery and Black servitude. Many of the loyalists were slave owners in America. And many historic sites have these colonial ties. And the programming has not really connected to this slavery. But thoughts are evolving, obviously, and though the stories are hard to trace, even though they are literally in plain sight on the census records, us in Heritage are trying our best to uncover these stories and make sure that this does not become a forgotten history. So of course we have to address our past with all of this. Our educational program needs to bridge these gaps, needs to tell all the stories, not just of historic, but also of modern Black populations. We need to, of course, care about and uplift Black voices, and also reevaluate and address the systemic issues that remain in order to make Mississauga a more equitable place. And one of the big pushes towards this has come from the newly created Mississauga Black Caucus. In 2022, they presented a report which discussed various recommendations for the city of Mississauga to make the city more equitable. It's a really great read. I encourage everyone to go look at that. That's online. So I'm very interested to see what happens in the future, what concrete steps are made to address our past, present, and our future as well. And if, of course, if you're interested in these topics, you can, there's many more readings that you can do. Unsettling the Great White North is one that I heard that was pretty good. Jim Crow Also Lived Here was written by Leonard Paris about his experiences of growing up Black in New Glasgow, Nova Scotia. And I had the pleasure of meeting Mr. Paris, and he is a very cool guy. And we were discussing the book, and it just sounds very interesting. And he actually ended up working in Mississauga at UTM. So he has such an interesting story. I would highly, highly encourage everyone to check that out. Frying Plantain by Zalika Reed-Benta. I was able to interview Zalika, so that's actually in a video from last year, I believe. And that follows it's like a coming of age journey of a young Jamaican girl in Little Jamaica, Toronto. And yeah, it's a really great read as well. Also, Heritage Mississauga, we put together a educational booklet on early Black history in Mississauga, which is free. So if anyone is interested in that, you can certainly come by to the Grange and pick that up. We offer that as well to teachers if you're interested as educational resources for your students. Also, we do have comic books. So they talk about different stories in Mississauga's history, but two of them do relate to early Black history. One is called The Legend of Cedar Park, and the other one is called The Legend of the North Star. Cedar Park is, of course, about the Ross family, and The Legend of the North Star is about the Thomas family, both of which are discussed in this presentation. And of course, from all of us, we would really be interested if anyone has any pictures, stories, information, artifacts, anything like that relating to being Black in Mississauga, because we really want these stories to be heard. And also, like I was saying earlier, I would really like to delve a bit more into the topic of modern Black populations. So I would really like to do a part 2 to this presentation in the future sometime, kind of talking about throughout the 20th century. So if anyone has any resources that I would love to learn about that and chit chat a little bit about that. So be sure to, if you have anything that you want to share, you can email history@heritagemississauga.org. And from all of us at Heritage Mississauga, thank you so much and happy Black History Month. And be sure to follow us, like, subscribe to our Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, YouTube as well. We are active on all of that. And also, of course, visit our website at www.heritagemississauga.com. Thank you so much. And I will see you again in another Saturday matinee. Bye.